About 5 years ago, I had an experience I couldn't explain and still can't. Part of me knows what it was, I think, and just doesn't want to acknowledge the truth. I was dating a girl who had a car camping build-out. When you folded the back seats down, she had a wooden platform that was built up for storage underneath. This left enough room for a double mattress on top, as long as you slid yourself in because otherwise you'd knock your head on the ceiling. Anyway, we packed up and went to her favorite campground. When we got there, a worker who my girlfriend knew, let's call him John, was at the check-in desk. He was trembling quite a bit. I assumed it was because of a medical problem, and he said very little other than just a grunted acknowledgement in response to us. He did go through all the actions of checking us in, but with lots of intermittent twitching that slowed him down. My girlfriend was kind of watching him wide-eyed and asked, "John, you feeling okay?" He handed her the tag to put in the car windshield and grunted, "Go." So he did. I asked her if John had some sort of medical condition, maybe something neurological that was affecting his brain. She shook her head, and she had this sort of blank, fearful look in her eyes. "No, John's always been perfectly healthy as far as I know, and really friendly." She was obviously concerned, but we got to our camp spot and got busy setting up the pop-up tent for over the picnic table and getting the car set up for sleep. As night fell, we made a fire, hung out, ate some food, and crawled into the back of the car to get some sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear my girlfriend sobbing. I turned over and saw she wasn't sleeping next to me. So I sat up fast and hit my head on the car ceiling. Dizzied, I rolled out of the back seat and started calling my girlfriend's name, but I couldn't find her. Flashlights went on at the campsite next to us, and I felt bad for waking them up, but I could still hear my girlfriend sobbing. Suddenly, a light starts moving toward me from the direction of the bathrooms. I expected her to think I was going crazy, but she instantly said to me, "Is someone hurt?" She had heard the sobbing too. At this point, it stopped. The lights next door went out, and we decided to slip back into the car and lock the doors. We were inside for less than a minute when we hear what sounded like a hand smack the side of the SUV and slide along the side. We were face level with the car windows, and we peeked out to see John, hunched over and having huge, twitching tremors. As his hand slid to each door, he tried each handle, trying to get in. When he realized they were all locked, he walked away. As he did, we heard the same sob from before slipping into the distance. The next morning, we went to report what John had done. A new worker was at the desk window. We gave them a report of the night before, and they told us that John should not have even been at the campground at that point. But that morning, when they came into work, his car was still there, but he was nowhere to be found. A little background first. As I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was there for isn't important. During my stay there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. Supposedly, years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we'd be woken up and expected to stand near the front of our cells while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of these routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off during his check. When a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out, they found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of another man over him. Loosely fitting, draped over him, apparently looked like a real monster. The scariest things were, though, was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into the prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that? They never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker, but that's what the prison called him, the Skinwalker. Didn't help that the guy never talked, apparently. Anyway, that's what started the whole Skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone in Gen Pop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Heck of a story to hear took place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now on to the real story, though. Sure, that guy was the Skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now, apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech but not replicate it. They twitch maniacally. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grand Master Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not be even able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. He would expect a skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time, as Carl thought, for years. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while in prison, people snap. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or just people going crazy, but I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything, but every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple of weeks before they were shipped off or transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were the nighttime occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig's dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in night by few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my walls on regular occasions when there was definitely no guards near my cell. One time near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a sprint. Whatever it was inhumanly fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate, and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep, of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing? I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part, though, he was coming back in to our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him, just left. He seemed fine with it, so was I. 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, Skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even sure if it was really him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, eyeing the other inmates and twitching maniacally. My family has strong Native American Sioux roots. This happened in rural Minnesota, June 2009, and I was pretty young at the time. My dad and I were riding our horses down the trail behind his house, heading to the gate that separated his land from the state forest. As we neared the gate, the horses' heads lifted and their ears perked with alarm. We followed their line of sight, noticing animal movement around a clump of trees. It appeared to be a dog or coyote sniffing around, so my dad pointed it out. "Hey, Queen Brave, look at that, coyote." We didn't think a lot of it. While coyotes are a neat sight, it's not really anything special for the area, and it is standard behavior for coyotes to be fearful of humans, so we expected it would be on its merry way. Wildlife forgotten, my dad dismounted his horse and moved toward the gate to unlatch it so we could continue our ride. But as he was doing so, the animal headed in our direction until it was only a few feet away behind the fence. It stopped, and we were stunned not only by its audacity, but by the size of it. It was absolutely huge and definitely not a coyote, but a unique attribute was the purple collar it sported. Still, we didn't see it as anything more than a weird occurrence, and wrote it off as someone's large and friendly, wolfish husky that had gotten loose, and my dad got back on his horse so we could go. Once my dad was off the ground again, this thing started to move, and gosh, was it intelligent. It easily glided under the fence and went straight to me, smaller person on a smaller horse. But its eyes were on my dad, obviously trying to calculate what he was going to do. It circled my horse and began attempting to separate her from the other one, which was when we both realized something was wrong with this situation. It did not look crazed. There was no foaming at the mouth or unnatural movements. That's what was unnerving. The wolf was collected and precise in everything it did. My dad, being excellent in high-pressure situations, calmly dismounted once more and looked the wolf square in the eyes and yelled at it to go away as he menacingly lunged at it. I can assure you his voice is more intimidating, especially when raised, yet the wolf didn't even flinch. Next, he instructed me to steer my horse, being the more aggressive equine of the two, so the wolf was between her rear end and the fence post. I do as asked, and his plan works. Almost. She kicked at the wolf hard, and we could hear its skull collide with her hoof and the fence post. This didn't faze it, and it got back up without any visible signs of pain or injury. At this point, my dad explained that we were going to turn around and try to go to the barn, figuring it wouldn't follow us to the front yard. We began walking back, him leading the horse and me riding mine, but the wolf's interest was trained on me, and it didn't give up on circling my horse. About halfway to the barn, my dad saw the wolf wasn't going to flee and called 911 to get help. The emergency responder was very dismissive, and my dad was fighting with her to send officers. The wolf picked up on his distraction and took this opportunity to attack my horse, snapping at her legs. I panicked, screeching to my dad she was being attacked, and he requested help for the last time before telling the responder that he had to go. We reached the front yard without any major issues, but progress was slow going because my dad had to watch the wolf, the horses, and me. Meanwhile, it remained solely intrigued in me and kept circling. Unfortunately, the plan to use the barn fell through after remembering we closed the garage-like door, and the only way to open it was manually from inside the barn. Not wanting to leave us alone with the wolf, my dad rerouted us to the dog kennel, which was surrounded by a decently sized fence. The wolf didn't follow me or the horses, and my dad closed us in while he went to the house to retrieve his rifle. The wolf nosed around the yard casually until my dad returned, and after seeing his gun, the wolf ran. My dad fired but didn't manage to hit it, despite being an excellent shot. Immediately, he tried to find paw prints to determine where the wolf had disappeared to, but didn't find anything. And this is when 2 police officers showed up. The officers looked downright terrified once informed of what was going on, and my dad expressed interest in looking for the wolf, to which they hesitantly agreed. They searched the property for an hour or so, but didn't find anything, and they left. My dad and I got the horses calmed, and we examined them for injuries. Mine had a deep gash on the back of her foreleg. I'm not sure what to think of what happened. I may just be overthinking things, or my sister may just have been joking with me. I figured I would share this small story here, in case anyone has any insight as to what happened. However, I don't think I quite believe anything as monstrous as I suspected to be at fault. I probably just misheard. For perspective, I will tell you that I live out in the southern part of British Columbia, Canada. I live a good half-hour away from the nearest town by car, and my home is completely surrounded by forest, with a few distant neighbors. It is not uncommon for us to see and hear coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars, so we have a large dog for protection. However, the latest dog just passed on, so her new protector is just a puppy, and she's not very brave just yet, and I don't think she could have helped the situation if she wanted to. It happened the summer after my graduation. I got a call from one of my neighbors asking if I could tend to her garden while she and her husband went on a fishing trip. I took the walk down the hill with my dog through the brush so that she could lay out the details of specific care her plants would need. My family has known this woman since we moved into our home 20 years ago, and as children we would all go down to visit her, make her cards and chat, and she would allow us to play in her swimming pool in the summer. I trust her completely and have house sat for her before, so it was no odd request for my sister and I to go out and help. The garden was new and absolutely beautiful. I have a garden of my own, but it was nothing compared to hers, which was gated in and was in pristine condition. The mosquitoes were horrid, so she made her instructions short, and I retreated back up the hill to inform my little sister of our assignment. The first day was terribly hot. My sister and I attempted to get up early to evade the heat and bloodsuckers, but in the end they were all sitting in the shade waiting for us to arrive. It took a full hour and a half to completely soak the entire garden, and by then we were sweating, bloody, itchy, and irritable from all our newfound bite marks. We were supposed to water the garden every morning so that the sun wouldn't dry up the water throughout the day. So I got up early to wake my sister who, after yesterday's entertainment, refused to go down with me, protesting that she wanted to sleep in and to leave her alone. Not wanting to be held responsible for the demise of my neighbor's veggies, I reluctantly trotted down the path to my neighbor's. Both my dogs were off on some squirrel-infested adventure, so the trek was made alone, only a few birds that morning until I made it farther, and the closer I got, the quieter I became. My attention, however, was on the sun, and I wanted to finish my task as soon as possible. When I was almost done, I took a stretch and went to turn off the hose, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Across the field from the garden, I thought I heard a person, which would have been very odd, so I stood still to listen. What I heard was my sister calling my name in a shrill voice. My sister and I would often call each other in strange, exaggerated screeches and voices in just that particular way. I knew for a fact my sister is far too lazy to hike all the way down and sneak through the bush across the field just to yell my name. I listened again but heard nothing. Finishing up, I assumed I had just misheard, believing it to have been a bird or something, though the odd happening stuck in my mind. Later on, I referred the account to my sister, who laughed and joked with me that it must have been this creature her friend told her about. The creature she was referring to was called a Skinwalker. The creature she was referring to was called a Wendigo or Skinwalker. I honestly don't know the difference between the two, or if they are the same thing. I don't know what these creatures are or if they actually exist, but if they were to, they are supposed to live in this kind of area. I put it out of my mind, not believing in such things. The next day, I was with my sister, tending the garden, and my dog came down to see us. I was shocked to see her paw was all bloody. Thinking she had cut herself on a piece of sheet metal, I ran with her back up to the house to see if I could clean and fix it. My sister didn't want to come up with me, so she stayed in the garden to finish up watering her part. Turned out the blood on my dog's paw was not her own, and she had simply caught an unfortunate pack rat, who she had delightedly torn to pieces. When I came back down, my sister wasn't in the garden. Confused, I began to walk to my neighbor's house, when she came outside to meet me. She told me she had heard her name being called from across the field in my voice, in the same way I had heard mine. She was visibly spooked and insisted we go back up to her house and leave the garden for tomorrow. I refused and told her she could go up without me if she wanted, but I had to finish the garden. I suspected she was only kidding with me, and I was waiting for her to give up her refusal right away, like she normally would. Instead, she stayed with me, holding her arms and refusing to walk up alone. Once we finished, we both came back together for the next 3 mornings to water the garden, and no other occurrences happened. To this day, my sister claimed she wasn't lying. I'm not sure if these creatures are supposed to be smart enough or talented enough to pull off stunts so specific. We had lived in the same house in the middle of the woods our whole lives, and we can be loud and silly without fear of annoying anyone. But if someone or something had been close enough to listen, they definitely had plenty of money and time to do so. Also, how these occurrences only happen when we were alone gives me goosebumps. I lived in Waynesboro, Virginia for about 5 years, less than 10 miles to the BRP North entrance, Skyline Drive South entrance. I used to take bike rides along Skyline Drive all the time, and always kept a year-long membership. Only in the day, though, just to frame the story. One night I was having a particularly hard time settling in for bed, so I decided to start up the bike and ride up to the first overlook on Skyline, only about a mile inside the park. It was about 11 p.m. when I got there, and pitch black. I killed the bike and got immediately uncomfortable. I'm not a guy that gets spooked in the dark. Truthfully, I prefer the dark in most situations. You can see people before they see you. You are practically invisible, unless someone is looking for you. And I find the natural privacy comforting. Not up there, though. It was a thick, oppressive dark. Worse than anything I experienced outside of a cave, and worse than any moonless night on the Appalachian Trail. I immediately got freaked out, big time. There's nothing up here besides wildlife, I reassured myself, internally. I had my revolver from when I lived and hiked the Pacific Northwest, bear country and all that jazz, tucked into my CCW holster, so I knew I definitely outmatched anything that could have been there, 2-legged snakes included. So I sat in the dark, leaning against the bike for a while and looking at the few lights I could see in the valley below. I managed about 10 minutes before I physically felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. I only did 27 months in Iraq, but I remembered that precise feeling. Someone was watching me. Something bad was coming. It was the same sensation I would get before IDF came in, or the shooting started somewhere nearby. I'm no psychic or whatever, but it's a common thing among vets with any time under their belt. Ask 'em about it. You can feel hateful eyes on you. The overlook was a sheer drop, or nearly so I wasn't concerned about anything popping up in that direction. But the mountainside and thick, untamed woods were behind me. I started thinking about methed-out dudes creeping the Appalachian Trail, bears and the like. The AT is no stranger to random violence. Still feeling creeped out, I took up a seat on the waist-high stone wall that marked the overlook ledge, facing the woods. Again, I can't emphasize how dark it was. But Gris, you might say, why not turn on the bike and use the lights? It'll at least help you see what's close. True, but my bike is loud, and the last thing I wanted was attention. Plus, the light would just night blind me to anything just out of view, and the noise would obscure any stealthy sounding creeping going on. So, no thanks. I'll watch and listen for a bit. I sat in the dark for another 10 minutes or so, anxiety getting worse and worse. I heard a few things, but nothing out of the ordinary for a night in the woods. I decided to head home, since the feeling wasn't going away. Like I said, I had a big bore on me, so anything playing games would be in for a powerful surprise if the games got stupid. Hopping onto my Suzuki, I started it up and rode off toward the gate. Now, anyone who lives in the country and rides a bike knows that wildlife is crazy active on roads that aren't traveled often at night. Being nighttime and technically closed, I had to ride around a gate to get in. There were no other vehicles on the road at all. I hadn't seen a single other person since leaving Waynesboro proper. The speed limit was 30 miles per hour, but I clipped along at a measly 15 miles per hour to keep an eye out for deer and wildlife. It wouldn't do me any good to mess myself up in a wreck, only to lay there all night until someone happened across me in the morning. Then I saw it. The term of almost deer is really fitting, but not quite accurate. It was like a deer that someone who had never seen a deer drew, but only after someone else had described it to them. It stood on the left side of the road, the mountainside, and I saw the eyes long before my headlight shone it fully. It was big, easily the biggest deer I've seen, and the lack of any horns that time of year suggested that it was a doe. The head was almost bovine in shape, but fixed to a deer's frame. The legs seemed too long in proportion to the body, and the body was extremely barrel-chested. I've always been creeped out by malformed wildlife, and this was no exception. Unfortunately, I had to get it to move, or risk passing within a few feet of it. I was not traveling another 30-plus miles up the road in the other direction, to leave through another gate in the middle of the night. And I wasn't getting close to it. Dangers of it spooking and running into the side of my cruiser aside, I didn't want to get near it at all. Stopping and putting my feet down about 30 feet away from it, I tried to frighten it away. I flashed my beams down to low and back to high. Nothing. I revved the engine. Nothing. I honked the considerable horn. Nada. Resting the bike on the kickstand, I left it idling and hopped off. I yelled at the thing and it still didn't budge. So I started to the side of the road to grab something to toss the near deer thing, hoping to spook it that way. As soon as I crossed into the other lane, it rose up onto its hind legs. I froze, putting my hand on my gun. I wasn't about to get charged by an angry, confused, malformed doe. It took 2 jerky, unnatural steps towards the center of the lane on 2 legs and froze again, staring directly at me. It suddenly shook its head wildly like a dog with a toy, took another short step, then hopped on 2 legs several times until it disappeared into the darkness on the right side of the road. I stepped back to the bike, mounted it, kicked up the kickstand, and turned the light towards the side of the road. On that side, there was a sheer drop of about 75 to 80 degrees compared to the roadway, and the thing's head was just peeking over the edge, still looking at me. The drop-off was about 40 to 50 feet, so there's no way it was standing at the base of the mountainside. I cracked the throttle and got the heck out of there. Road wildlife be damned. I never went back up on Skyline Drive at night alone after that. One time was enough. There are things we don't grok out there, or things that just visit for a while. Whatever it wasn't from around these parts in Hilltalk. It can go back to wherever it came from and stay there. My husband used to have an explosive temper, right? Well, he's quelled it. It'll be an important piece. We're leaving our friend's campsite in an area we were familiar with. We get to this weird split where it's 5 ways and the GPS isn't super clear because backwoods Kentucky. We ultimately make a wrong turn, but the GPS is silent, so we keep going. Husband says, we need to turn around. The GPS flashed quickly and set the new route. I said, let's just go. It's got a route. Let's just get out of here. It's only like 10 minutes further. So this road is full of kinky, swishy, twisty, turny roads. We're in a Nissan Armada that we rented. Usually if my husband were mad, he'd be speeding through the hills like a madman trying to get out of there. But he wasn't. We were talking through it and kept him calm, and he was taking the corners extra slow because there were massive drop-offs with no guardrails, oncoming traffic whipping around corners at us. It was scary, so we went slowly. We come around this particularly sharp bend with a hill in the middle of it, and we see 2 dogs laying down. It looks like they're the kind you'd see as the statues at the end of a driveway, except they're laying perpendicular on the dirt driveway, and they don't move. And then their eyes catch our headlights. As our headlights hit them, we realize, my son, my husband, and myself, that the dogs are identical. Remember, we're taking this corner slowly. We got a good look, especially me, because they were on my side. Identical. Always as our headlights hit their eyes, they stood up at the exact same time, and like a marching band, started on the same pause, walking towards our car at the same time. I have a massive amount of chills just typing that. So that was a super sharp left, okay? Where the dogs were. As we go to do an adjacent right turn, I'm still looking at the dogs, because they were right outside my door. I was transfixed and creeped out. I look forward again just in time to see something run across the street. I yelled, "Deer!" instinctively. But when I thought about it, that was no deer. Deer don't move that fast. I've seen plenty of deer crossing the road. Husband got a better look at it, and he wasn't looking at the dogs. He said it looked like something super emaciated, maybe hunched over, but on 4 legs. It was fast too, man. I just saw 4 legs and a flash. Jake said it had some green glowing eyes. Freaked me out. It took us another 45 minutes to get back to some sort of main highway, and it was just hairpin windy and twisty the whole way, so husband was going super slow. Dude, we were freaked. I just kept talking very slowly in a low voice because I couldn't even start the Spotify on my phone without messing up the GPS. So no music, no happiness, just freaked out driving in backwoods Kentucky. Thankfully, that was it, and we made it. Oh, I did see 2 deer, and they ran, and there is no way that other thing was a deer. Let me start this by saying that I have lived in the Appalachian Mountains all my life and have experienced a lot of strange things. My family was Irish and settled in West Virginia, but I currently live in the North Carolina portion of these wonderful mountains. That being said, I have learned a lot about what really lurks in these woods, but this was nothing like I had ever experienced before. It all begins with my golden retriever Ozzy growling like I had never heard before. He literally never growls, so that had me really uncomfortable. But this growl was bone-chilling. It was like he was getting ready to have a fight for his life or something. I took both him and my other dog out at around 11 p.m. and he would not leave my side. I noticed that my workshop door was open, so I walked down to close and lock it up. The entire time, he is glued to my side. Ozzy also kept trying to get between my legs, still growling and all of his hair sticking straight up, like a feral animal. The second that I close the door, all hell breaks loose in the woods. It sounded like 50 full-grown men had broken out into a full sprint, tearing through the woods. Trees were shaking and branches were falling. In all of my life, I have never been that scared. We got back in the house before I crapped my pants, and I got my pistol/mag light to figure out what the heck was going on out there. When the dog and I got back outside, we were surrounded by what sounded like people mumbling. It was everywhere. I shined the light all over the woods and couldn't see anything, but the sound was coming from all around. It sounded as if you got a gym full of people to baby mumble. You could almost make out words. That's why I don't think it was an animal. I almost immediately felt sick, like I was having a panic attack. And back inside the house, it sounded like people were walking around all night. The windows were creaking, and you could clearly hear the sound of shoes on gravel. The mumbling never stopped. Every time I got up to check the house, my feet would touch the floor and it would get dead silent. You couldn't hear birds, crickets, frogs, or anything. I was terrified and didn't sleep a wink. Air felt thick and evil all night, and that's the only way that I can explain this feeling. Imagine a soaking wet quilt being tossed over you. That's how I felt. I'm looking for any answers as to what this could be. This wasn't like the normal spooky stories that my grandma and great-uncles used to tell me. I feel like this scene traumatized me since I remember it so well whenever I think of fear. The reason this memory scares me till this day is probably because I have yet to discover what animal it was. My closest bet would be probably raccoons, but the uncertainty is what frightens me so much. That day I decided to push a bit more, and even though I was at a shelter with my trail fam, it was dusk. I just wanted to keep moving and night hike to the closest camping spot ahead. We'd been there before. I waited about the momentary rain in the shelter and started hiking moments before it actually got dark. My buddy told me not to drink the water from one of the water sources ahead, because apparently there was a factory accident or something contaminating the stream or river. I remember going downhill from that shelter, crossing the stream, then having to cross the highway that was pretty wide. It had a thickly wooded median strip. At this point, I was ready to pitch my tent anywhere, but the surrounding didn't permit that, so I kept going. I got to a wooded section of the trail, where everything around my headlamp was pitch dark. The headlamp, by the way, had an issue, most likely because of a weak battery. It would just dim itself, and I would have to reset it. It was enough to see where my next step was going, so I just kept it dim. This is when I encounter a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the night. Nothing out of the ordinary when night hiking. Could be anything, really. Eyes were medium size, roughly 4 to 5 inches apart, and 4 foot off the ground. Right next to them was another pair of eyes, but slightly smaller and shorter. My first thought was actually bear cubs. Because of the way they acted, it really reminded me of curious cubs, mesmerized behind their mama. I just let them be and focused on moving forward. And this is when I saw it. 1, 2, 3 more of them. One all slightly varying in size, and this time on my left. I grabbed my trekking poke, a clever name that I made for a modified trekking pole the size of a stake, and started banging it on a tree. The eyes didn't move at all, just stared back at me. Fine, I kept moving while I banged the passing trees with my poke. Then, as the trail turns right in front of me, I see this line of about a dozen pairs of eyes, all of them just sitting there in the outlines of the trees without moving one bit. This is when the fear started flowing, so I picked up my pace and turned right, ignoring any glare in my peripheral vision. I just stormed the heck out of there. Soon, I was out of that section, and I managed to make it to a pond where I stealth camp. Whenever I would tell others about this, they would shrug it off, thinking that I'm probably exaggerating or that it was nothing serious. But experiencing it firsthand, all alone, knowing that you're greatly outnumbered, was really, really scary. I wonder if anyone else has had similar experiences that they can't explain and get out of their minds. Funny thing is, I just realized that my trekking poke died/broke that night while I was using it to climb some rocks shortly after this episode. It was quite an adventurous hike. I was told this story over the past summer by someone that I met running a campground up by the Yellowstone/Tetons area. It was a privately owned campground located in the greater Yellowstone region. Anyhow, I checked in, met the dude running the spot. He was really laid back and down to earth, and even gave me updated accommodations, glamping instead of my campsite, for free. Anyhow, we connected pretty well. I felt comfortable around him and safe at his spot, which is more important as I travel solo mostly. As we started chatting one morning and he was telling me how he spent his time 2 to 3 months ago on the Appalachian Trail, starting in Georgia and moving up north. I don't remember how it was brought up, but he begins to tell me how one day he found a cut-off trail, an old carriage road or something, and that it was pretty quiet. Not many Appalachian hikers go off in this portion. Anyhow, he starts telling me how one day he's hiking and begins hearing branches and twigs breaking off on the trail beside his. Being the only one there, he suspects it's an animal. According to him, he sets up camp that night and begins hearing the same noises around his campsite. Well, he begins to get sketched out and decides that he'll rest quickly and get back on the trail. Morning comes and he hits the trail again and begins hearing the same noises. He begins telling me how he starts to get a little sketched out at this point. He seemed pretty legit, getting emotional and whatnot. Not overly dramatic. You could tell that he was affected by recalling this. The dude tells me that he starts picking up his pace on the trail and the noises begin to keep pace with him. Finally, he reached a ranger station, which was closed. He said that he was so freaked out that he was ready to break in when a ranger pulls up and sees him, distraught. He starts explaining what is going on, and supposedly the ranger tells him that he's surprised he made it that far by himself and lets him in the station. He gets inside, and the ranger shows him a storage area with around a dozen packs that he claimed to have picked up with nobody around. Now the story gets weird, and I feel like the guy is full of crap. But again, he seems pretty emotional. He claims that while at the station, he and the ranger hear something on the roof, and he starts mimicking the sounds that this creature was making. Pretty much just strange and obnoxious creature noises. He claims that it was Mothman or an alien. I have no clue what this dude was recalling, or if he was full of crap. However, it sent me on a quest to see if anyone else has had similar experiences on this portion of the Appalachian Trail. This is a strange encounter I had well over a decade ago. In fact, probably about 16 years or so now. I used to hang out with a guy named Jeremy constantly. We were almost always together, really good friends. He lived in a town a bit away from where I'm now calling Fosterburg. The back half of this town was mostly farms and wooded areas, more or less the country, as we called it then. His nearest neighbor was about 10 minutes away, if walking on foot. During the summers, we'd take turns spending the nights at one another's houses nearly every night. He'd stay at mine for a night, then I'd stay at his. We'd often walk back and forth between our houses, even though it was an hour-and-a-half walk. Our favorite thing to do was stay up all night playing video games, usually RPGs. This was during the 16-bit era, SNES times, going into the N64 times. And when we'd get bored or one of us had been playing too long, we'd often sneak out of his house and go exploring. As I said, he lived in a pretty rural area, so there was always somewhere new to go. We'd often grab up some flashlights and bring a stick, bat, or knife with us and go exploring in the backwoods. On this particular night, we'd left around 3 a.m. or so. We were crossing through a cornfield, cracking dirty jokes the whole time, when we came to a clearing leading into a new set of woods we'd never been into. So we decided to go ahead and check it out. The woods were thick, and dawn was starting to show slightly. A bit of light was coming out when we'd made it pretty far in. We decided we should probably start heading back home to make sure we snuck back in before his parents got up for work and noticed us missing. We'd probably spent a good hour or so getting this far. As we were turning around to go back through, Jeremy noticed what looked like a little, and I mean very little shack, 100 or so feet in front of us. He mentioned considering to explore it, but I was starting to get a bad feeling thinking about it. It kinda creeped me out. We instead decided we'd just explore for 10-15 minutes or so around it and then leave. Maybe come back later in full daylight. Dawn was coming, but it was still pretty dark, though we could see to navigate through the woods without the need of flashlights now. Of course, even in full daylight, it's always still darker in the dense woods due to the canopy overhead. So we went snooping a bit, taking in the little shack. It was rickety looking, had 2 windows. One was almost entirely broken out, some of the glass even still on the ground outside. We were taking in the side of the place. It was rectangular shaped. The door wasn't on our side. We were being pretty quiet because, for whatever reason, our overactive imaginations kept assuming someone was inside the thing, sleeping or something. We stepped around to the side that would be the front of the shack with the door, and there was this little clearing several feet in front of us. There was a big tree stump, and a man was sitting on it. This immediately made us halt and barely breathe. He didn't seem to notice us. It was still pretty dark, as I'd said, so it was hard to make out a whole lot, but the guy looked pretty tall and kind of broad-shouldered. We stood there staring for a few seconds, unsure how to react without making enough noise to alert the guy. I was wondering how he hadn't noticed us yet already, actually. The guy stood up suddenly, though, and turned around toward us. He was gigantic. His legs seemed abnormally long, and he stood seriously taller than the shack, which had to have been at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe even 7 foot itself. The guy didn't move at first, but he was holding a wood-cutting axe, and all of a sudden he let out the most horrible-sounding moan I've ever heard in real life, like that of tremendous anguish. As we began to smell something rotten, like roadkill and a rotten egg mixed together, he took 2 steps forward, closing a lot of distance quickly, and we started running. We ran near blindly back through the woods, not even caring where we came out at, as long as it led us back to Jeremy's house. We got back panting and wheezing and just stared at each other, both of us thinking the same thing, which we discussed. Did that really just happen? Jeremy realized that in our hurry to escape the woods, he dropped and lost his pocket knife somewhere along the way. It was creepy, and neither of us slept much that night. But 2 days later, we were walking from my house to his. When we got to his front yard, he mentioned that the air smelt terrible. It smelled of rot, like what we'd smelled near the shack in the woods. We got close to the house and noticed a pocket knife sticking out of the tree closest to the house, the very same one Jeremy had lost in the woods. To this day, I cannot explain this, and typing it up here is giving me goosebumps. It's probably the craziest thing I've ever personally experienced. That shook me up for a long time. Had a lot of trouble sleeping for weeks because I'd keep seeing that inhumanly tall man stepping towards me and recall the rank smell that suddenly hit us, along with the terrible moaning that the man let out. Scared the heck out of me, and probably the absolute scariest moment of my life. I don't know what that guy was, who he was, and we never saw him again. We did go back near the shack again once in the daylight a month or so later. My girlfriend at the time heard the story from Jeremy and thought it was a crock of crap to scare her. So we took her out to see the shack. We didn't stick around long enough for anything to happen, if it would have. But on our way back, she said the atmosphere of the place really creeped her out, and she wanted to get back home. I have always been an avid outdoorsman, always hunted, always fished. I'm from Missouri, and I know what we have and what we don't have. We have a few mountain lions scattered around and even fewer black bears. The only common thing that are big and wild are deer, coyotes, and turkeys. Our farm is situated on bluffs and ridges along the Missouri River in the center of the state, and while it's actually pretty populated, the terrain is incredibly rough and hard to get around on. That being said, our acreage isn't huge, but the surface area is. All kinds of ravines, gullies, hollows, etc. It was a few years ago when I was halfway through undergrad and went home on a weekend during bow season. So it's a half-hour drive from the house to the farm, and I show up well before daylight. As luck would have it, I forgot my keys to my dad's box stand. That didn't bother me much, though, because, like I said, rough terrain. It isn't hard to find a spot that sits over a game trail where I can have some elevation and cover. All I had was a pack with some stuff like a knife, rope, tags, my bow, and a little LED flashlight. I took off down the side of a ridge and found a good little spot where I could lean against a tree that overlooked a trail with some brush in front of me for cover. I got there probably too early, and there was no sign of daylight yet, especially considering how thick the woods were. I had been standing there for half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then I heard a pack of coyotes. Like I said, not unusual. We have those. What I didn't like was that I was on the ground with only a bow in the dark, and the yips and howls were getting closer. I've never heard of them bothering people, but you know how surprised animals freak out. So I was getting ready to maybe arrow a coyote and was listening intently to where they were. As they came closer, I noticed something bigger was with them. My initial thought was that they were chasing a deer. They were really tearing up the leaves as they came, and the yipping and howling was right there with them. They must have passed me maybe 30 or 40 yards down the hillside, went right on without noticing me at all. So I kind of eased up. I probably wasn't going to have to shoot anything for a while yet. Right when I was relaxed, I heard this long, loud whoa coming from right behind me. I don't think I've ever jumped up, spun around, and drawn a bow so fast. After about a minute, I let off the draw, but I kept my release on the string. I didn't move for another hour, not till I could see a ways without a light. After the sun came up enough, I walked out very slowly and kept looking behind me. Got the truck and went home. I was totally done hunting for the weekend. Like I've said, I've been in those woods my entire life, and I've never heard anything like that. Thought about owls and looked up every owl call I could find, and none of them were like that. The only thing that I've heard that sounds like that are supposed Bigfoot vocalizations. At any rate, the whole thing was weird. I would never have thought it was so remotely possible for something like that, if they exist at all, to be found in Missouri, so close to civilization. Of course, after I did some Googling, I found other cases of Missouri settings, and a lot of them. I would never have thought it was remotely possible for something like that, if they exist at all, to be found in Missouri, so close to civilization. A long time ago, my friend Jason and I were prone to getting involved in many types of misadventures. And this one, while seemingly pointless at the start, proved to be one to remember. While I am uncertain of the name of the campsite in question, I do know that it was one my father and I had visited on many occasions. One particular night, after a lousy day of fishing, Jason and I decided that hiding in the brush overlooking the river, as darkness set in around us, would offer a great opportunity to see the night come alive. And it kind of did. We heard rather than saw bats overhead as they picked off insects over the open water. We saw raccoons and even some deer that strolled through the dark, wary of anything out of the ordinary. The familiar sounds of buzzing insects and chirping crickets berated our ears, reminding us where we were and that there was life all around us. But even reminders have a tendency to go mute. The silence was not an abrupt one, but rather a dying down, swooping steadily over us from one side to the other. The clicks and chirps from the bats stopped. The buzzing and flying insects around us retreated. Having been accustomed to outdoor evening antics, my friend and I both understood that, at that point, we were less alone than we had been previously. Where was the threat coming from, though? And what could it be? We both had our minds set on it being something like a coyote, or possibly a mountain lion. Whatever it was, we knew that staying still was our best option. Long minutes passed in shared silence, broken only by our shallow breaths of expectancy, as we strained our eyes in the darkness, trying to pick out anything moving through the leafed canopy and ground brush. A group of crickets to our left started to chirp again, less lively than before, when we thought that perhaps any sign of danger had passed. Suddenly there was a strange scent in the air, earthy and musky. Where was it coming from, though? I was about to stand up and head back to camp, while we could still find it, when an odd shape seemed to detach itself from the trees before us, close to the riverbank. My heart stopped in my throat. The form was huge, almost monstrous in size, but strangely human in its movement. It cast a heavy gaze to the right and to the left before beckoning to another unseen form, still hiding from our shared line of sight. What was going on here? In no time, another form, smaller than the other, came out of the brush and scurried to join the larger one at the edge of the stream. Jason and I were curious, though equally frightened over what we were seeing. Was this a mother and child drinking from the river? Huge hands attached to the long arms scooped water from the river and brought it up to the face and rubbed it over the hair on its arms and body. They're bathing, I thought. Whatever we had stumbled upon was bathing both parent and child. Jason and I watched in interest. The only thought I was dwelling on was how quiet these beings were. Their movements over the terrain were absolutely silent. Eventually, the two left their place along the river and melted back into the black of trees around us. Long minutes of uncertainty passed before the insect noises started up again, and we knew that we were safe to head back through the bramble to camp again. The meeting, though brief, had left the two of us with little question as to the validity that there may be something else out there, uncertain, unidentified, but absolutely alive and well. Not a pro, but more than 1,000 days in the back country over the past decade. I have been drawn to the wild. It seems like home, and I generally know my neighbors out there. Not afraid to be in the deep woods, in the dark. Love my woods. One sunny weekday afternoon, I had dirt biked up an old mining road. It gained a couple 1,000 feet from the valley floor towards the ridges of the Cascades. When the road gave out near the bottom of a high basin, I put on my backpack and started off cross-country toward the ridge. It was still heavily forested, old growth and old cut fading in another 1,000 feet into those scraggly, wind-blown ones near the top. About 20 minutes in, and about half a mile up from me, near the tree line, I heard this thumping sound. It was very odd, so I stopped to listen carefully. It sounded like a big, solid branch was being whacked against a solid tree. I used the term solid because its hits were powerful. One or both of the pieces of wood were hard and dry. The wood resonated and rang on impact as dry wood will. I couldn't get over the power, though. It sounded like someone was swinging a 4-inch post. Weird, right? Well, it gets better. This someone sounded like they were trying to communicate. The thumping had a very complex and well-defined pattern. And here's the weirdest part. The thumping signal occasionally became very rapid, like what a drummer could do if they were noodling around with a stick. But I swear, it sounded like a 4-inch post was being treated lightly as a drumstick. I listened for maybe 5 minutes, just fascinated with this sound, this code, and the power of it. Then the drumming suddenly stopped, and I kind of woke up to the fear of this unknown thing out there. I had my pistol, I had my bear spray, and my knife. I really only fear cougars, and even then, I figure they'll have a bad day trying to take me down. Still, the silence as I started into the forest ahead seemed loaded, and I turned on my heels and left that valley. That place and that experience gave me the chills, and that high valley won't see my shadow again. So I believe it was May 13th, 2012. I had taken a train to Olympia, Washington, and then hitched the rest of the way to Westport because I wanted to learn to surf. Anyway, after renting a surfboard and flailing around in the water for a day or two, it was getting close to sunset, and I had to find a place to sleep. I found out that it was illegal to sleep on the beach, but someone suggested that I go down to Grayland State Park. Not only did I have the option of paying for a campsite, but I could find a place to lay my stuff down and sleep without being bothered. So I hitched down Highway 105 to the park and decided against buying a campsite and hike through the woods to the beach. I found a couple of small landmarks to remind where my things were and set them down. I was surprised at how empty the area was. There was one RV with the blinds down and a couple fast asleep in another campsite. Otherwise, it was deserted as I sat disappointed that the bathroom had no electricity. I smoked a long cigar and enjoyed my time alone. Night fell, and I began to walk back towards my impromptu beach camp when I realized I couldn't see a darn thing. The moon was relatively bright, but the wind was intense, and the forest canopy blocked the moonlight. I continued walking through the trees with my hands out in front of me, so I didn't hit anything. At this point, I was a little creeped out. Dark, empty woods at night are creepy. Howling wind that covers any other sound is creepy. But I pressed on because I'm more adventurous than that. Besides, the beach was easy to find. Just walk west until you reach the Pacific. Big ocean. Can't miss it. I came out onto the beach, and none of my landmarks were there. I might have gone a little north or south, I didn't know, but I thought the dim light from my cell phone could help me find that weird rock marker near the edge of the woods. I went back into the forest. Never had I thought that I could be so lost in such a small area. I couldn't have been more than half a mile from my things. And yes, the woods are creepy, but I'll hang in there until the scream. Directly behind and to my right, I heard the most startling howl. I jumped, swore, and began to run. I don't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. I couldn't run too fast because I couldn't see. The noise continued, although I was getting further from it. That was encouraging. So I ran a little faster until I slammed my left shoulder into a tree that I didn't see. Barely catching myself, I slowed down despite the adrenaline, and as I slowly walk, I remember reading that these are contained screech owls. Well, shoot, I thought. Screech owls are startling. Eventually I came back to the beach, wandered up and down until I found my stuff, and went to sleep. That was 2 summers ago. Earlier this year, after getting interested in Bigfoot, I was telling someone my story. They asked if I could send them a recording of a western screech owl. So I Googled it. I couldn't actually find a recording that matched what I heard. Screech owls have several calls, but this one was not one of them. Weird, I thought. Then later I found out that Gary's Harbor County, where I was, has some of the highest number of BFRO reports in Washington. What I heard wasn't the famous whoop howl, but it was similar in pitch and unbelievably loud. I'd hardly call a scary noise in the woods proof of an undiscovered ape, but that's my story. About 15 years ago, I lived in Sulphur, Oklahoma. My playground, the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. I loved that park so much. I rode more miles on my bike than anywhere else. I've walked nearly every trail and rode every road. Every day I would ride my mountain bike up and down the trails and would be home by nightfall most days. One night, however, I had rode out a bit further than usual. On my way back, however, I decided to ride the trail from an area known as Buffalo Springs, where they have live buffalo roam and there is a large spring/fountain for all to enjoy. As I was riding back, I knew the end of the trail was coming up and I would have to cross a stone bridge across the creek, then up the road to my home. It was dark at this time, and all I had to use to see was the full moon. I was about maybe a few hundred yards from it when I got a sharp pain in my left thigh. I stopped and looked around to see what had just hit me, then a noise sounding like something hitting the ground hard in front of me. There was a rock, just about the size of a baseball, rolling across the trail. Me, confused, starts to look up the side of the hill. Just as I turn my head to look, I almost fall off my bike when another rock comes flying down, hitting the front of my wheel. I finally have my eyes adjust to look and see someone very tall and dark and covered in hair at the top of the hill, throwing things at me and screaming. I yelled that I had a cell phone and was going to call the police. I didn't actually have one, as I didn't have a cell phone yet. This seemed to have angered it. He started charging down the hill at me. I, for obvious reasons, light up bike and took off. Just as I crossed the bridge, I hear a huge splashing noise in the creek, and seen it was a large rock that had been thrown. I was in the clear to home, but was frightened all the way there. I went to the ranger station later the next morning and told a ranger I knew about what happened. He says, "So, you were attacked by a Bigfoot?" snidely laughing. I said, "I don't know what it was, but something was trying to hurt me out there." Okay, Justin, if I have any more Bigfoot, I'll let you know what we get. I just said fine and left. The very next week, I was riding, in the daylight, when PR pulled up next to me and said to get in. I asked why. He said he needed to show me something. We head up to the police department in town. Before we got out of the car, he turns to me and says, Justin, I have to give you a huge apology. I'll be honest that I didn't believe you when you told me the story of you being attacked. However, it has come to my attention that a couple was out in the same area last night and was attacked in the same way, saying they had seen a large, hairy creature throwing rocks and sticks and screaming at them. They called the police, and they came out, and some of the other rangers, including myself. I immediately thought about what you had told me. When we arrived and started up the hill, sure enough, we were having rocks and things thrown at us. Guns drawn and yelling, 2 officers tackled a man to the ground. He was 6'5" tall, naked, covered in mud, and had long hair and a large beard. He had escaped from the Veterans Center across Veterans Lake. Apparently, he thought he was back in Vietnam and he was trying to take out the enemy. PR said I was very lucky because he was trying to kill me. We went inside so I could give the police my statement as to what had happened. They had him sent to a more secure facility somewhere else. To this day, I still get shivers when I hike that trail, and I always keep my eyes on the ridge top. I do feel bad for ones with PTSD and such mental illness, but crazy Mr. Bigfoot man, let's not meet again. My entire childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to his insomnia from shift work. Our neighborhood is considered very safe and ultimately was an urban neighborhood. Besides, one of the roads towards the back of the neighborhood being lined with thick forest for about 1.25 miles deep, which made a circle back in itself. All of these walks were very dear memories of mine, except one, and it ended up being the last one. Along the road with the tree line, there was a single streetlight to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was very common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we're walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stops, pulls me close, puts a hand over my mouth, crouches with me, and points towards the single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I see a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny with long limbs, materialize out of the plot's bush line and cautiously take in its surroundings before signaling towards the bush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures materialize as well. After a brief moment of what looked to be a discussion, all 3 made a dash for the forest tree line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for home, which was roughly a half-mile back. Mind you, my father is 6'5", 220 pounds, and I was roughly 120 pounds at this time, and he never showed signs of slowing due to his fear and adrenaline. After this night, we never took late-night walks. He installed 4 bright motion detecting lights around our acre plot and brought a dog home. The few times I tried bringing it up, he doesn't want to discuss and made it clear that he never wanted to. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the 3 huddled together is very vivid 15 years later. This happened about 5 years ago, out in Pennsylvania. My brother is a major hiking enthusiast who's hiked all 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks. He lives in Colorado and brags about hiking 14ers with his buddies all the time, like it's no big deal. So, him coming home to PA to hike the Loyalsock River with me was a prime opportunity for him to downplay the terrain and talk about how he'd have me hiking all 57 miles in 2 days, because this was nothing compared to out west. I don't think he believed me when I told him how wet it was going to be. But he knows everything. Whatever, he's a jerk, but I missed him, and had been wanting to hike this for a while, so I thought it would be nice to catch up and hang out. So we hike, and inevitably my brother did not bring enough socks after getting our feet soaked in the creeks and mud, and he was pissy when he reached the campsite. We didn't get to go as far as he wanted. We set up camp, and he hangs his 2 pairs of socks to dry, and we crack open some cold ones. It's relatively early but dark out, and we were the only people around. We heard some clanging noises off in the distance at one point, something being struck against something else. But it was far off to the north, and in the woods, and kind of scattered. We got tired pretty quick and hit the sack. I couldn't fall asleep for a while because my gut was backed up from traveling. You know, like when you go on vacation and you're ready to relax, and next thing you know, you can't go to the bathroom? Yeah, my stomach was just starting to move, and it was really uncomfortable. And I was just staring up at the trees and the stars through the mesh top of the tent. I could tell my brother couldn't sleep either because he was rolling around a lot. Eventually, he snaps at me and asks what the heck I'm doing. I guess I was keeping him up, trying to get comfortable. Dude, I gotta go try and take a dump, I told him. He was like, okay, I gotta take a piss anyway. So he heads out into the trees with me. We walked a ways away from the trail because you don't want to take a dump too close to the water source or near your campsite. I'm squatted and my brother is a few yards away waiting for me to finish my business. Next thing you know, he's like sneaking toward me, going, dude, look. Moving through the woods were 3 huge figures and a smaller one that was still pretty big. I can't make heads or tails of it through the trees, and all I can really tell is that these things are walking upright and had really long gaits. I'm just trying not to make any noise as I hike up my pants and try to get my eyes to focus through the dark. Right as they passed closest to us, still a few yards away, I almost feel, more than I see, my brother reach for his side, and I said, no! My brother always carries a pistol hiking because out west there's grizzly bears and whatnot. But this is PA. We don't have grizzlies, and he knows that. But these creatures heard and took off running. They were so big and their limbs so long that it almost looked like they were moving in slow motion. But they were running. So we took off running too, back to camp. Back in the tent, feeling stupidly safer zipped up inside, we were really quiet for a while. Then my brother starts sniggering and imitated me in a squeaky voice. No! I just glared at him. Come on, bro, he says. I wasn't gonna shoot. It was just in case they charged. I don't think either of us slept much, but my brother tried to play it cool like nothing happened the night before. We pack up, and right as we step back onto the trail, just outside of the campsite, we find a fresh, ripped-up possum, still leaking blood out onto the trail. My brother took off, shaking his head no, like he was refusing to accept what he saw. From that moment through the rest of the hike, my brother regularly touched his gun on his hip like he was checking it was still there. I teased him the rest of the time, telling him Sasquatch was going to get him. But honestly, I think I did it because I was just as freaked out as he was. Yesterday, I noticed my neighbor hadn't put out all his Halloween decorations yet. For the past 2 years that I lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well. He's younger, single, but I know that he's really good with kids. He loves Halloween. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway and saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up, or that house up the street is going to beat you for best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy outside. I asked him if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming around our neighborhood, which is a pretty safe neighborhood with tons of young families living there. So I asked him what happened. He said last year he had his brother's family over so they could trick-or-treat in the neighborhood, since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door like always. His family took off around 10:30, and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters, but by 11:30 they were pretty much done. So he was inside watching TV and the doorbell rings. He grabs a candy bowl and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight, and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters to still be out. But then he notices that he hasn't turned off all of his decorations and lights yet, so his house is still a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell "boo" or something to freak them out, but he stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13 or 14, and the other was 16 or 17, both boys. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness, like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him, and he noticed that they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there, holding the candy bowl like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character and ask for candy or something. The younger one said that they had gotten lost and needed to come inside to use his phone, and that's when he closed the door more than halfway on them and said, "No, sorry." The older one said something like, "Can we just wait in your house until our parents come and get us?" But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something or intending to rob him. He just kept mumbling, "No, I'm sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so scared at that point that they were going to try and break through one of the windows or something. But he looked through the peephole and they had turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all. He said that he stayed up until 5 a.m. because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my God, this sounds so familiar, just like the black-eyed kids urban legend. Then I think, hey, maybe this dude's trying to scare me because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him incredulously, but trying not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, that's really crazy. Sounds like the black-eyed kids. He just looked at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? And I said, no, but I told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later, I get a knock on my door, and admittedly, I almost jumped out of my skin, thinking there was a demon child at my door. It was my neighbor, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of black-eyed kids before, and that what he read was so familiar to what happened to him. So we take a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about the urban legend. It's possible it was just teenagers with black scleral contacts, trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius, by the way. But he said the fear he felt was so primal, and came over him the second that he opened the door, that it just had to be something paranormal. Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos, with one earbud in, so I could hear my infant daughter if she cried. That way, my wife could get a full night's sleep. She works at 4 a.m. at the hospital every day. That was about the time I decided to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I dozed off, I heard a thumping coming from my front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room, and realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, I dozed back off. Then, again, I heard the thumping. "Darn cat," I mumbled. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to see that he wasn't there anymore. Now that I was up again, I wasn't the least bit tired. I figured I'll just get some tea and check Facebook while I'm up, maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. And there they were, the top of two short-statured people's heads cresting the stairs just above my window frame. The people were just short enough not to see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned, but the knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump that I had just blamed on my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept by the back door up to the baby's room. I assumed it was some of the people from the housing district across the road. Maybe they were high or hiding from cops, or looking for my cousin who stays with me often and has a lot of friends over there. The last thing I needed was to try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep, even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got to my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows, both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect time. These stoners were going to wake up my daughter if I didn't run them off now. Angry, I went out to the kitchen, unlocked and opened the door, ready to run outside of the house and kick some little idiots' butts. It happened then. Standing there, looking up at me, were two 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. And then the smaller of the two boys spoke. "May we use your telegraph?" "Huh?" I just stared blankly at these boys, horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use my telegraph. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No crickets chirping, dogs, cars, nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell or anything that would have made sense of the situation. And I calmly replied, "I don't have service at my house. Sorry." The expressions on their faces turned to rage as soon as I finished my sentence. Swiftly I shut the door and locked it as quickly as I could, and then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from the crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the windows was back. I dropped to the floor as close to the wall as I could and held my little girl in my arms and wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard it. My wife's alarm clock. The thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked. "I just had a bad dream." That's all I could mutter. "Okay, well, give me the baby so I can feed her before work." I handed my wife the baby, and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made coffee for her, and for some reason just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing had happened. I walked her out to the car nervously with the baby in my arms. I asked her not to leave until I walked back into the house. She was a little put off by the request, but did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the door again, and in the house I sat horrified until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house. And here I sit, horrified while she sleeps in the guest room with our daughter, wondering why they stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of the black-eyed kids. She wasn't. Every story I've ever read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry. I'm scared, and I can't calm down. My husband suddenly decided to divorce me, but it's not him or the divorce I'm afraid of. I think something was attached to him, and like a leech, attached itself to me. I am away from him now, but after an emotional phone call, I think the thing has reattached itself to me. The first 10 years of our relationship, my soon-to-be ex-husband was a young man who tried to uphold his farm boy values and worked very hard. He was kind and considerate, although there were a few times that, now, looking back, there were red flags that his mask slipped, or that a secret rage he was holding back came peeking through. In our first apartment, he did some things that freaked me out. The biggest being I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him leaning over me, his face an inch from mine. I'd try and get him to lie back down, but he was difficult to wake, just hovering over me. Sometimes he'd talk back to me, one time saying, "Go in through the mouth." I thought it was gibberish because he spoke of reptile scales and types of rocks, things he had no interest in. The longer we were together, the less it happened, until, as far as I know, he stopped. His hidden side really started to show when I was bit by a tick and became very sick with Lyme disease. It hadn't worked regularly since. It destroyed me. Granted, I had a handful of medical problems that were difficult to pin down, including my ribs caving in. But I worked when I could, especially around the holidays, to help out. Sometimes when I'd tried to talk to him about something silly around the house, he'd lose his temper. He'd get close and scream at me, suddenly gaslighting me and putting me down for choices regarding my work and health I thought we'd made together. But this was so few and far between. I chalked it up to the stress of his work, or being the sole breadwinner. I tried to do my part to be his cheerleader, no matter what, managing the finances and keeping up on what I could physically manage in the house. Then his father died. Let me give you a little background on him. My ex-husband was one of many children, and Dad was a bit of a crook. He always excused his father's means of making money when they grew up, saying he had to do it to support all of us. By the time I started dating my husband, his father lived in the basement of the house. He loved strip clubs and drinking and left filth and adult toys out where all the kids could see, because the laundry room was right there next to the couch he slept on, which was also next to the computer he loudly played dirty videos on. We could all hear the moaning and noises through the floor. His father also liked to secretly tuck away the liquor in great binges, something the now teenagers knew little about, until they found bottles hidden around the basement when he moved when their parents divorced. Before he died, he drank copious amounts of wine outright. There was a lot of vicious fighting in that house. His father always seemed the darkest when he'd come out of the basement after a long time alone. Periods of time where we couldn't hear dirty videos playing through the floor, where it was utterly silent from below. One night, when we were in our late teens or early 20s, I was hanging out with my ex-husband in his room. My husband decided to take a shower, and I laid on the bed watching TV. About 15 minutes later, he came into his bedroom looking freaked out. I asked him what was wrong, and he said when he went down to the laundry room to grab clean clothes from the dryer, he saw his dad in his tighty whities, hunched before the dark corner under the stairs. When he asked him what he was doing, his dad only mumbled. My ex walked closer, trying to figure out what was going on, and his dad swung around like Gollum, clutching the ring, and growled, "F off!" His brothers had also seen strange incidents. Only one of them, who later became a Reiki master, admitted that there was a horrid, dark energy that emanated from beneath those stairs. He claims it was a dark portal to this day. The rest of the family doesn't talk about the negative things about their dad since his death, or at least very rarely. When they do, it never includes the basement. My husband became darker, quieter after his dad passed when we were in our late 20s, a tension surrounding him that never really left. Back to modern day. My husband became withdrawn. There were days he was present, and other days where he made me feel like a terrible person for speaking to him while he hid in the basement playing video games. I tried to have conversations with him about jobs I thought I could handle, but he wouldn't hear of it. No, your health is my #1 priority. I don't want you working right now. To back up a minute, my biggest physical complaint is my chest caving in. Since moving in with my ex, my ribs started to fall inward, creating a bowl of sorts in my chest. It happens to people with autoimmune issues. This is very painful and makes it difficult to breathe. Just keep this symptom in mind moving forward. Soon, all my ex did was hide in the basement, drinking as much as he could hide, but I had an idea. I'd set the ultimatum he'd get sober 3 years before, and I knew from his brief relapses that isolating was a big red flag. He'd binge drink like his dad did, causing embarrassing scenes at weddings and parties, but most importantly, wrecking his health and hurting our marriage. After asking his brother for advice, I approached my ex-husband about his cleanliness around the house. He'd become sloppy, leaving clothes in piles that the cat peed on, and even once they'd been peed on, he'd walk right past them. I refused to clean them up. He was unsanitary in the kitchen, breading chicken or eggplant on the countertop using raw eggs and leaving it for me to clean. He became so vicious so quickly when I approached him, throwing things around the kitchen, screaming at me with his finger in my face and backing me up into a corner. He just kept telling me that I should be more grateful because I had an unwillingness to work. But hadn't he discouraged me from multiple jobs I'd considered lately? I was still backed into the corner. He would not move, just stood there heaving, staring at me. So I pushed him so I could get out. How dare he intimidate me, a woman with his size, and how dare he gaslight me? But also, I was scared. His eyes, bright and gray, seemed to go dark with rage. The next day, when I asked him to promise not to do that to me again, he kept screaming, "Who pushed who?" Keeping a distance, I followed him as he ranted and raved and slipped into the basement bathroom. He didn't know I was a ways outside the bathroom recording on my phone. I needed proof of these rages, and I didn't want him to come out and corner me again, or do something worse, which I doubted he would do on camera. All I could hear him saying was, "It's distorted, so distorted." Then, after repeating this over a dozen times, he slipped into mumbling, and I thought he said something about scales in his mouth. I called my father to get me out of there, and my parents took me into their home. My ex-husband wrote me a horribly degrading letter soon after, in which he told me he wanted a divorce. Since moving in with my parents while I got on my feet, the bowl in my chest, or cave-in, started to heal. I could actually feel the bottom of my sternum again. The ribs slipping back into their natural position is painful within itself. But my God, I could breathe again. I chalked it up to being away from him, thinking the building abuse had been triggering my autoimmune issues, and now I was free. He called me a few nights ago, and he was horribly drunk. We haven't spoken in weeks. He was slurring and crying, really bad off. He had gotten in trouble at work for going into a rage at a coworker, telling him to F off or he'd knock its lights out. "It felt so good," he sobbed. I talked him off the ledge and got his siblings to check in on him. That night, I woke up to him leaning over me in my bed. Shocked and scared, I whispered his name, and he said nothing. I tried to tell him he shouldn't be here, that he had to leave. As I hyperventilated with fear, he said, "The scales go in through the mouth." Next thing I knew, I was waking up the next morning, and I assumed it was a dream. But now my ribs are collapsing, but rapidly this time. In my back, the muscles stretch as the ribs spread apart, ligaments cracking. and in the front, the muscles are pinched between ribs collapsing inward. I can't breathe. I can hardly stand. It is agony. I've been admitted to the hospital and they keep trying to relax my muscles, but they're hardening. They're talking about emergency surgery now, but I doubt it will matter. My ribs will just collapse inward again, crushing my lungs and heart. I think there was a dark entity in his father that fed off the crimes he committed. I think the entity took interest in my husband, and when his dad died, it transferred completely to him, where it could feed off of me. I'm scared, lying in the hospital bed. I'll take any suggestions on how to stop it before my organs are crushed.